once again, everyone's favorite place to hang out on a Tuesday. This is Nuance. I'm Mike Scala, and I'm joined, as always, by Jay Carter, also known as Timid, the hip-hop artist and the chair of BLM Tokyo. How you doing, Timid?
Doing all right. How about yourself?
Doing well. Trying to stay cool in the summer heat.
Yeah, everybody's facing a little bit of that. I'm okay though. I'm good. So
nice over there.
Hydrated.
Yeah, huh? It's nice out in Japan, or how's the weather?
Japan has some serious summers. They have some very humid and hot summers, so it's no different this time around. You know, you got to stay hydrated. You know, I got these joints with me.
What is that?
Around in the summer, since gets so hot, and to avoid heat stroke around the summer, these things pop up, and they're little salt candies that have potassium in them, have salt in them, and they help to try to, if people get dehydrated, to help kind of fight that dehydration. So heat stroke, that kind of thing.
There you go. Well, some housekeeping. We did have a guest scheduled, Erica Banks, but she had to postpone. So we will have her on in a future episode. But fret not, because we have our good friend Paul Trust, who's joining us, and he's going to talk about something very topical. In fact, last week we actually brought it up. You are suing the city over cuts to education in the budget, right?
Correct. Yes, the city and the Department of Education.
So we can get into that in a few minutes. I think it's a very important thing to discuss. I'm glad we have you on this week to talk about it. But we'd like to start off with something on the lighter side. Anything in particular we want to bring up this time? I know before we went on, we were talking about landlords and how frustrating they could be and real estate people when they're trying to get an apartment. Have you had any experience with that, Jay? I mean, I know you rented a few places. You kind of lived all over the place.
I didn't have that. When I was in New York, I didn't have that issue. I mean, I really had the one place, and that was that was pretty easy getting into. There was the posting on the side of the building with the people, the phone number to called them up, sent the application in, and there was no issue. And I
were they asking for a lot of information, documentation at the time?
Not really. I think it was, proof of employment. And from what I remember, there wasn't much more after that. It was more like a proof of employment, of course, ID and that type of thing. But yeah, nothing. I don't think there was anything too significant, like no bank statements or anything, if I remember correctly. I do remember that, they had a property management company that was managing the property. And normally, I guess you're supposed to call the property management company, and then they deal with the building, but I called them directly because the number was on the building, and so the property management company didn't get their cut, and so apparently a lot of people had just called the number, and that's how people were moving in. So like they were having issues with the property management company because they were upset because they weren't getting a cut. It's like, what do you need a cut for?
Right.
The number's on the building. We're calling them directly. They're handling it directly. Like you don't need a cut. You didn't do anything.
Right. And I know that they changed the law recently about security deposits, because I think they used to sometimes ask for first month, last month, and security deposits. So you had to pay like 3 months up front, which is a lot of money for many people. They just changed that, I believe. So now it's only 2 months, essentially, first month and security deposit that you would have to pay. So that's a good thing. They did make some reforms around that. But I found recently, because I'm helping my mom out now, there have still been issues with landlords and realtors, to me, asking for too much information. It felt a little too intrusive to me, because they do ask now for bank statements. They ask the credit reports, and they're not supposed to deny you an apartment based on a credit score, but they still ask for it. So you know how that goes. Now, we do have good credit, so it's not a problem for us, but just the fact that they're asking for it made me a little uneasy. And they also seem to want, like you said, employment, not just history, but like proof of employment, but in the form of pay stubs. So if you have your own business, if you're self-employed, or if you're retired, like my mom is, you're not going to be able to provide pay stubs. And that became a challenge also, because they wanted, it seemed like a lot of people were just expecting someone who just lived paycheck to paycheck, but then they were complaining that they couldn't kick people out if they had to evict someone. It's so impossible now because tenants have all these rights, and because even COVID shut the courts down, it was so hard, and people would just stay in the apartment forever. But if you are concerned about that, shouldn't you want someone who has the ability to pay? It seems to me like they wanted someone who was paycheck to paycheck. And if I was able to show that we had all this money, that didn't matter to them. In fact, one person, not to call anyone out, but one person actually said, well, if you have a lot of money in the bank, that doesn't mean anything because you could gamble it away. You can invest in crypto and lose it all tomorrow. To me, I think you're much more likely to lose a job than you are to lose a lot of money saved up in the bank that will cover multiple years' rent. It seemed backwards to me.
Yeah, I can see that. But at the same time, yeah, I can. Sorry, I got tissue here. At the same time, I can understand some of it, but it does sound like they wanted way too much information. But I can understand them wanting like pay stubs and proof of income, because again, like you could lose the money. It could be in investments. It could be something, but supposedly the income is more secure. But supposedly. But again, if you got it in the bank and you can pay it off, then that should count for something as well, I think.
I can't see how income, paycheck, because you could lose your job pretty easily. But are you really going to lose a lot of money in the bank? If you can show that right now, you can cover multiple years. And let's say it's a 1-year lease. You can just pay the landlord for the whole year up front if you wanted to. I mean, the money is there. To me, that's much more secure than just having a job and being paycheck to paycheck. Because if you lose that job, you're not going to be able to pay the bills.
Yeah. I mean, there's something to that too, definitely.
And they also wanted more too. They wanted letters of recommendation.
That's crazy.
Yeah, they wanted all kinds of stuff. Some of them wanted taxes. They wanted your income tax. And they want, of course, your social security number so they can pull their own credit reports on you. I mean, it was a lot.
Yeah, that sounds like it's a little bit of overkill. So, yeah, it's crazy. What do you think about that, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I luckily own my place now, but back before when I used to rent, last time I rented, it was rent stabilized, and there's always issues. And this is back up when I lived in Harlem, and there was always issues. A lot of my friends had rent stabilized, and they were always looking for ways to kind of kick them out. And from what we could tell, if they did enough in renovations, then they could flip the apartment and get some Columbia kid and pay like twice as much for them to move in. That was always the risk. And after I left, I had a roommate. So after I left, the roommate ended up renting the room as an Airbnb. He had a roommate for like a year and then started to rent out the room, but he would always be there, which is a sort of gray area because it did say in his lease that he can't rent out the apartment as an Airbnb. In his mind, he's like, well, I'm here. It's just the other room. But either way, the management flipped, and the new people who ended up owning tried to drag me into a lawsuit, to try to kick them out. And I'm like, why are you calling me? And he's like, well, we don't have a record that you're not on the lease anymore. And I'm like, I said, well, I haven't signed a lease with you in 5 years. And I'm like, the last lease I signed was in whatever it was, 2005. And I'm like, and I haven't signed a lease since that has my name on it. And they're like, well, that doesn't mean you moved out. I'm like, but isn't that the whole idea of signing a lease? It's like, this is who lives there. And so,
that you moved out basically, right? To shift the burden to you to show that you were no longer involved.
Yeah, I from what I can tell, sometimes with these lawsuits, they cast a wide net. And they're like, we don't think you're taking this as seriously. You have the potential of being sued here. And I'm like, I didn't do anything. Let's deal with him.
Right.
Nothing to do with me. And we gave him, I guess, enough proof that I, wasn't there, that they just left me alone eventually. But I felt bad for the guy. I had to leave the apartment. And I'm sure they just renovated it and started charging a lot more than rent stabilization. I think this is a common thing. We talk about, insecurity for a lot of people, low income living. I think this is something that a lot of real estate landlord owners try to do because they don't want a rent stabilized apartment.
Sure. And I know a lot of leases now do specifically have an Airbnb clause. So you cannot use this for Airbnb. Now, the law was always that, like you mentioned, if you are living in the apartment, you can rent out part of it to someone else, as long as you're not leaving it and renting the entire thing out to someone as an Airbnb. But if the lease specifies you can't use it for that purpose, then you're not allowed to according to the lease, right? Not the law, but the lease.
Right. Yeah. So I think his interpretation was, well, I'm not using the whole apartment, I'm using a room.
Right.
So he was kind of hoping to skate.
You're trying to find a loophole.
My guess is the old management was just not on top of it. It was like, whatever goes. There was so much going on in that building to begin with. Then the new people bought it, and then they really started coming down. That's
right. I also wanted to mention the duty to mitigate damages, which sounds like fancy legalese, but it's an important part of this area of the law. When I was renting in Virginia years ago, they had that duty where if a tenant broke a lease, if a tenant left before the lease was up, the landlord couldn't just sue the tenant for the money that was left on the lease. They had to first make an attempt to mitigate their damages. In other words, to re-rent the place to someone else. And then they can go after the tenant if they weren't able to make up that money. Let's say they rented it for less somehow, after good faith efforts to rent it for the same or more, and they lost money, or they weren't able to rent it at all. They could then, whatever money they were out of the lease, they could sue the tenant to make them whole, but they first had to try at least to make up their money. And in a system like that, what ends up happening often is there's no reason to ever sue the tenant because you can re-rent for more money usually. And so you're not out any money. If the tenant leaves a few months early, you end up turning a profit really by immediately renting to someone else for more money because of how the market is. But that was in Virginia and other states. New York didn't have that until more recently. When I was in the state Senate, I was as counsel in the legislature, I proposed that bill and it took a while to get it going. We finally got it passed a couple of years ago in New York. So now that's the law also in New York, but it wasn't, right? It used to be that if you just moved out, your landlord could just sue you immediately, but now at least they have to make an effort to rent to someone else first.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Because a lot of people get freaked out like at the idea of breaking a lease, like, oh my goodness, you're breaking a lease. But most of the times you're not going to get sued for that, because the landlord is going to make more money charging someone else more money for that same apartment.
Is there not a
I think it was always about the getting the deposit back, right? Like if you break the lease, you're not going to get.
That's right. If you break the contract, you'll have a hard time getting a security deposit back.
Right. I don't know there, but sometimes isn't there also a fee to break the lease? If you break it early, you have to pay something extra as well.
Sometimes they might put that in the lease itself.
Right.
But again, there's a duty to mitigate. So even if there was a fee, let's say that tax on an additional $500, if the landlord makes up that money, they can't collect it from you. They can only collect what they were not able to make up by renting it to someone else.
True.
And also, the security deposit isn't supposed to be used for the last month's rent, but that's oftentimes how it works out. Like if, let's say you're getting security deposit back, but you left a month early, then they can say, okay, well, it basically is the same deal as if you just paid your full amount, right?
Right, yeah. Which, that could work in the favor of the tenant as well, because, then the cash is already paid, so you don't have to come out of pocket for something. So, as long as there's that agreement, and then at the time, it should be fine.
Yeah, but it's rough these days. And with COVID, especially with all the courts closed, I mean, it was true that you weren't able to go to court and evict a tenant if you needed to. So people did get stuck.
Yeah.
But there are also people who think that all evictions should be illegal. I mean, I don't know how that would work in society, but I do see that sometimes. When I was running for city council, I got one of these questionnaires from a group, and I was like, do you agree all evictions are bad and should be stopped? But okay, how is that really going to work realistically, though?
Right. I've seen that too. People calling for those types of things. And yeah, realistically, how would that work? Because if that person let's say the tenant just stops paying rent and for whatever reason, maybe they can't afford it or something bad's happened, or they just decide, hey, you know what? I'm not paying rent. Then the owner of the place is liable. I mean, because the bank still needs their mortgage payment. So the owner of the place has it, and now they don't have use of the place of their own property. So it's like, how does that really realistically work? Because if that's the case, then, you just rent someplace and be like, hey, I'm going to stop paying rent and you can't evict me. So I'm going to live here for free.
I did see some of that happen when I was hired to administer COVID rent relief funds for the state. I unfortunately did see cases where it looked like people were moving their families into large apartments during COVID and then never paying the rent. Like, I don't know how that really happens, but that's what they would do. Maybe they lived in a 1-bedroom. They moved into like this extravagant 3-bedroom for money that they couldn't afford, didn't pay the rent for not even 1 month, and then immediately applied for COVID rent relief from the state.
Right. Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, I don't know how that would work, or what's, if you say something like that, you've got to give some kind of a way or process that works out. You
Right.
can't
And of
just,
course, there are people who, like myself, believe housing is a human right. So we should do all we can to make sure people are housed. But you still have
sure.
to have a system in place to make it work. Because, like you said, under the system we have now, if you just say people don't have to pay rent, then it's going to lead to more foreclosures and people losing their homes and more people out on the street. I mean, you need to do something to make it work.
Yeah, definitely.
I know I used during the COVID with people not had a freeze on paying rent. I know I've spoken to a few owners of buildings, and they felt that they were being painted as the bad guy. That like these were not like mass developers and owners of huge conglomerate. It was like I own a store and 2 levels of apartments above it, and it's been in my family, and that's it. And and we depend on that to pay our bills. So it's a tough situation. In one sense, of course, you don't. Someone loses their job, things are tough, and you don't want to kick them out. But for someone who's like a small owner of just a couple units, like what do they do? Who's looking out for them? And I didn't know. That's how they felt, that no one was looking out for them. There were people looking out for those renting, but no one was looking out for the one who was like just a couple units.
Right. When people think of like a landlord or someone that's renting out a place, they tend to think, oh, well, that person must be like crazy rich because they own this property and they're renting it out. And they don't think that it could be a person who's just got 1 or 2 properties that they're renting out, and that it's paying for their investment while they've got tenants in there, but they don't have any other income or enough income to cover that cost for someone that's living in there that they get no benefit from. So
Right. They rely on that. It's not just extra income for a lot of people. They need that money.
Right. They're just, some of them are just everyday people. They're not big, massive companies.
Right.
So.
All right. Well, let's talk about the MTA. I was trying to think of a segue real quick, but I don't know. You might as well go from housing to transportation, right? Because we did mention how the MTA did put out its 20-year assessment plan. And I know a lot of people are saying, oh, 20 years is forever. But encouraging news is that the Rockaway Beach line was the only Queens subway project included in that. And so we always think that's encouraging. Of course, it doesn't mean that we're home free and we were getting the project. No, but we need it in that assessment plan. In other words, when the MTA is looking to the future at potential projects to expand the system, we definitely want that one in there. This is one that we've been fighting for a long time. So it's good to see that it was there. I know, Paul, obviously you work very closely on the Queens Link, which is the Rockaway Beach Line project. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So, from discussions with the MTA, one of the next steps, like just a quick backtrack, there was a study done that determined subway reactivation was feasible. It was the MTA study released in 2019, what they call the sketch assessment. They determined it was feasible. And in their next steps, which was like near the end of the report, they say there's a lot of questions that need to be answered to move this project forward, which would require what's called an EIS, an environmental impact statement. And when that's an extensive study, would do community outreach, would look at sound mitigation, vibration mitigation, would look at, is there anything of the current infrastructure that could still be viable to be used, shored up, some foundational issues. And so just looking at basically everything, how many cars it would take off the road, what would it do to the neighborhood surrounding. And so we were talking to the MTA saying that we would really like the study done to answer these questions so many people have, including ourselves. And they're like, well, we're developing this 20-year assessment, and for an EIS to be done, it would need to be considered as one of the proposals on that assessment. So for us, it was a big victory to see it listed as one of the proposals that hopefully we're assuming from what we read, it's on equal footing and be looked at impartially as a possibility of something that could be that they would determine to be worth investing.
Right. And for those who don't know, an EIS is required for any project that has a substantial impact on the environment. So it's something that needs to happen in the process. So if the Rockaway Beach Line or the Queens Link were to be built, this would be a required step, and it would be done prior to a final decision being made on a project. So it's kind of like the next step along the way, but it is necessary. It's not like, oh, why are you studying this again? Did you study? Like it needs to be done, and it's a crucial step in the process. And if you get it done, and if it's favorable, that can lead to it then being funded and implemented. So it's very important that this happens. And also, when we talk about environmental, the environmental impact, it's not just about the environment in the abstract as you might think of it. It's the environment, meaning the neighborhood's quality of life and traffic and parking in some cases, people's property values, all these different things. How does it affect the environment around the project, and what is it going to do to the city, to the infrastructure? All these different things need to be considered. It isn't just, does it cause more pollution, right? It's everything. It's really like a cost benefit analysis of the project, looking into it with great detail.
Yes, that is correct. And in the 2019 feasibility study, there was some things that were not looked at, which was kind of mind blowing to us, like the fact that the Rockaway Beach branch would cross the J train and would cross the A train, and they never included that as potential ridership for the line. But with this other line that sort of kind of runs parallel, the IBX, which Governor Hochul is behind, when they came up with a ridership estimate of 80,000 people daily, they looked at every line that it would cross and then added that in. So we know that projects are not being looked at the same way, and we're hoping as advocates that as this is being looked at against, like, say, the IBX or other transit related proposals that they could move forward with over the next 20 years, we want to make sure it's on equal footing. That's, like, as an advocacy group, I think that's going to be our next step, is to see if we can get the EIS, the study happening, and then make sure it's being considered in this 20-year needs assessment on equal footing with the other projects, right? Like not getting it sandbagged or something.
And also make sure the EIS is done properly, because we did have complaints with the feasibility study. And in fact, you and your group were able to uncover some of the discrepancies. And, it seemed like the cost was greatly inflated. And it seemed like, as you alluded to, the ridership was underestimated. So we want to make sure that the numbers are a fair assessment of the reality, because we have to take a look at the cost and benefit analysis. Obviously, it's going to cost a lot of money, but it's not going to cost as much money as they projected. And what is the economic development? What is the return on investment? That's really something that we need to see.
Sure. Yeah. So that study came out, which hyperinflated the cost. We had a corridor analysis done by a third party. We were able to get together some money from city council member discretionary funding. And we had them run the study, because everyone who was in the transit world was, like, looking at the numbers of the cost and, like, this would make it, like, the most expensive transit project in the world. Like, it's more expensive than what the Second Avenue subway is doing, going through Bedrock. And so they were like, no. So we were able to get them to do an analysis, and what we realized they did, I think they didn't think we would look at the numbers, but the cost for raw materials like concrete, steel, everything we agreed with, but what they did was something called soft costs, like, that are looking at, like, different, like, things like lawyers' fees, and everything was basically taken to what you can't really estimate, but they, like, did, like, a worst case scenario, like, oh, we'll just say it's going to cost this much, and then hyperinflated it. Whereas the company that we had called Thames that did their analysis, they put the cost from where the MTA had it at, which is, like, I believe 8.1 or 8.2, and they were able to bring it down to around $3.5 billion as more of a feasible cost. But when they released that study saying the ridership was 47,000, which is nothing, which is not nothing, that's still a decent ridership, but again, didn't look at the intersections with other lines. And then they said what the cost was. There were others like, oh, well, this can never happen. Everyone needs to move on. This is the nail in the coffin. And then we're like, hold on a minute. Something's a little funny here. So yes, as this moves forward to be looked at, hopefully again with fresh eyes and impartially, that's kind of our job, is to make sure. I think we're going to need to be a little bit of a watchdog on this.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's something that we've all fought for such a long time. And now we're talking about 60 years since the trains last ran on the Rockaway Beach line. So obviously long overdue, but hopefully now we'll be able to move forward with this EIS and just, keep the pressure on and keep it going, because people of Rockaway and people of Queens and really the people of New York City on the whole are demanding this. Anyway, anyone who's a transit advocate, anyone who takes the train to work, anyone who wants a better commute, anyone who wants to be able to travel north-south and not just east-west in Queens needs this. It's a very important project.
Agreed. And, I keep hearing horror stories of people trying to get to the Rockaways from Manhattan or Queens, Western Queens, Central Queens, about being stuck in the Van Wyck or any of those Woodhaven Boulevard for hours. And, this would get you there so much quicker. You could probably get from, say, Astoria to the Rockaways in under 45 minutes with, a transit line like this.
Right. And economic development is really a big part of this, because South Queens is cut off economically from the rest of Queens and from the rest of the city, because it's in such a transit desert. And just think about all the business opportunity that's lost, all the money, when you get people to school faster, when you get people to business faster, it's not just about leisure, right? It's about people's livelihoods. And it could really be a game changer for Queens and for the city.
I completely agree. I feel like our section of Queens, South Queens, is in a way like Staten Island. Like if you want to get to Manhattan, you got to go through Brooklyn. Like you can't it doesn't have the connectivity it should. And a lot of people I bet if you queried people in Astoria or Jackson Heights or Long Island City, have they heard of Richmond Hill? Probably most would say yes. Where is Richmond Hill? And I bet most of them will be like, by Flushing, right?
That's a great point. Yes, I agree 1,000% with that. And I've experienced that my whole life with South Queens. You go to most of the city and you say you're from Howard Beach, or you're from Richmond Hill, or Rosedale, Springfield Gardens. They've heard of these places, but they really have no idea where they are because they've never gone there. And there's no way of getting there if they take mass transit. It's so disconnected from the rest of the city.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and this is sort of, where everyone needs to be a community partner if a line was going to be built, because I'm sure, you've lived here a lot longer than I have, Mike, because I was in Jackson Heights up until a year ago. I'm sure there's a lot of people who kind of like it that way. They like their kind of quiet, removed neighborhoods. They like the fact that rents we talked about rent. Rents are significantly less than Western Queens. The cost to buy a house. I just saw a house on the market in Woodhaven. Looked really nice. I was kind of a little jealous of this. I saw a 6-bedroom, 3-bath house in Woodhaven, half a block from Jamaica Avenue, so right by the J train, going for $720,000, I think it was. A house like that in Western Queens would easily run you $1 million, twice that, probably more.
I think that's what you mentioned as far as economic development and everything, and people liking the quiet and whatnot. I think that's one thing people also should realize, that if you make it easier to get there, then there's going to be that's going to come with it too. It's not going to be necessarily as quiet as it was. More people are going to come. Those prices are going to go up because now people can access it and like, oh, well, it's a little bit cheaper there. Let's jump on the train and move there. We can still get access to where we go. And now everything is the values are going to go up, or the costs are going to go up as well.
It's certainly a concern. And that has clearly, we're not the first, part of, a city that has looked to improve mass transit. And, there are certain things that can be mitigated to keep like an abatement on raising taxes for, a certain number of years to, help. The thing is, you don't want displacement, right? You don't want to change no one wants to change the character of the neighborhood. I mean, me personally, I would love to see, I feel like Jamaica Avenue could use a little work. Just like I hear, people who love the Rockaways, there's areas of the Rockaways that could use a little work.
Right.
It doesn't, I want the area to flourish. The fine line that you bring up, Jay, is like, how do you help an area flourish and thrive and grow without making it unaffordable or no longer recognizable for the people who currently live there?
Right. And the thing is we're so transit starved in these areas that all we're asking really for is equity. We're not asking for a radical transformation of the area and all these, fancy bells and whistles. No, we just want a train to get to the city really and throughout Queens even faster than we can get now. I mean, yes, obviously it is going to create economic development, and that does come with a certain amount of change, but we're still just asking for something that we don't have that is going to make a big difference in people's lives. And, it's like we're kind of trying to get to zero in a way, like we're negative right now. We're just trying to catch up with the times and the rest of the city and just have a little bit more equity and fairness, right?
Right. And I think ridership too, and this goes back to, I don't know if you ever talked about the 2020 census at all in your show, but this goes back to, and I'm sure this is true probably, Mike, where you live compared to like where I live in Richmond Hill. I think we're seeing this all throughout South Queens, is that you have these originally single family homes that now the basement's rented out. The first floor is one family living there. The second floor is another family living there. So, and a lot of these families, I'm not sure if the census is representing all the people that are living, in these what used to be single family homes. I know there's been an issue. Of course, it came out with Ida about these illegally rented basements. There's a lot, and there's been a push to try to make it legal. But there's a lot of basements rented. And I'll tell you, I'll be out there with my hose, and someone will come by, watering the grass, and someone will come by and say, like, "Hey, you have a basement? Can I rent it?" But it happens many times. Wow. And I doubt these people are being included in what would be a potential ridership. But chances are, I'm guessing these people asking me, who are walking up to me, not driving in a car, may not have a license. We don't know their status of citizenship, and probably would really benefit from mass transit.
Sure. I want to shout out some of the people in the chat: James, Michelle, Peter, Lixa. Lixa says, we have the best mass transit system compared to the rest of the country. People of the Rockaways have the ferry. She says the transit system was designed over 100 years ago to commute in and out of Manhattan. It definitely needs a revamp. Yeah, that is true. But I would make the point that even in the Rockaways, yeah, you have the ferry to Manhattan and you can get to Manhattan, but you can't get to Midtown too easily. You can get to downtown, and people would say that, well, people in the Rockaways work downtown, so that's all they need. No, they work downtown because that's where they can get to. If you can get them to Midtown quicker, they'll take advantage of those jobs, maybe even start their own businesses in Midtown. I mean, Midtown Manhattan was suffering. You saw all the storefronts open and for rent, and they couldn't rent them out. If you can get people to Midtown quicker and connect Midtown Manhattan, which is supposed to be the center of our city, to the rest of the boroughs, then yeah, you'll see a lot more economic development on both sides. And I think that's only fair. People should be able to get to work, not just to downtown Manhattan, but to Midtown as well.
Very true. And one other thing that with the other line, the IBX, when they did like a promotional video that they pointed out, everything that they pointed out applies to reactivation of the Rockaway Beach branch. That nowadays, most people who live in their borough work in their borough. And we're seeing what is turning into a thriving commercial center in Jamaica. That's a very much a developing story. It seemed to me overnight, Long Island City all of a sudden became the city in itself, and you have Flushing. But how does someone in South or Central Queens get to these economic centers? You have to take a bus to a train. Buses aren't that reliable. They bunch all the time. So you want a reliable way to get to work, and it's also quality of life. Yeah, they could just take the Q10, and then they can catch on this. Okay, but instead of having a one train ride, this is now adding an hour of commuting a day that they're not spending with their family or seeing their kids off to school or having dinner with them. So it's quality of life.
Right, time is money. And what about the idea of taking mass transit to a restaurant, a nice restaurant in the city or in Queens even, to have dinner? If you're in a transit desert now, that's not too easy to do. And again, all these businesses, not just in South Queens, but throughout the city, could benefit if we connected it to Queens.
That's true too. And there's so many other benefits. Like if you take some of the heat off of, like, say, the J train or the A train, because you have other ways to get to Manhattan, you're going to find people are going to find a seat that is a long ride into Midtown. That's an hour plus, and, now you can find a seat, whereas before you would have to stand. And I could tell you, as someone who's taken the J and the A 5 days a week, going to my former school, is that a lot of the issues, like you talk about road rage, like, I don't know if there's a term, but there's train rage. And a lot of times it's because you're standing like this, you got someone here, you bump into them, it does this, and it causes a problem, get off me, I've seen it so many times. I mean, and unfortunately, I think there was just even a shooting on the A train. I don't know what caused that or what led to that, but a lot of times these heated moments happen from the packed train and people being upset, because a packed train also means the doors are opening, closing, opening. The train isn't moving. So the stress level goes up. All these things are adding stressors. So you're going to have a safer and quicker ride, and it's going to, make your commute enjoyable. And even if you're not taking the Rockaway Beach branch, reactivated.
Right. It's like a domino effect as well. So you did mention your former job. I want to get to that. I also wanted to mention really quickly, there was a police officer who lived in the Rockaways on Beach 139th, I believe, who tragically shot himself and passed away yesterday. So it's big news in the area. Our thoughts and condolences go out to the family. But I did want to get to what we really came to talk about, which is this lawsuit that you have against the city and the mayor, and you successfully won a TRO. So why don't you introduce that? I know people may not know, but you're a teacher, right? You teach a music program, and that was cut.
Yep.
And so you lost your job as a result of the New York City budget, right?
Correct. Yes. So if I take the story back, you got me in early June. I'm buying equipment. I'm planning for September. Starting to, I still have my spring concert and my graduation to do, but I'm starting to think about September and what I want to do and how I want to build my program even further and make it grow. And we had some budget. It was a use it or lose it type thing. So I'm buying some drums, getting some replacement gear, things that just got damaged from wear and tear. And then I get called into the principal's office. I'm like, oh no, what happened? Racing through my mind. What's going on here? My principal calls me in, and she's seated at the table with a smile, and the AP is seated with a smile. And they're like, "Hi, Paul, why don't you have a seat?" And I'm like, "Oh boy." So they sit me down, and they explain to me that the city council had just voted on a budget, and the budget is significantly cutting funding to many schools. And our school in particular was looking at losing about $500,000. And things were pretty threadbare to begin with. This is my school. I taught in Park Slope, Brooklyn. They said that with trying to figure out how they can keep the level of the quality of education up with the challenge of losing $500,000, unfortunately, it looks like they came down to a choice of either art or music would have to go. And they said during the pandemic, they felt like they prioritized music. At one point, we didn't have an art teacher. We hired one this year. And now they feel like they're going to prioritize art. And I'd been in the school. I was hired in 2009. I've been there, almost 13 years. And so now, after she laid out that scenario, my principal, she then said, "Listen, this is the worst case scenario. We have a feeling we can appeal our case and we have a good chance to win because the enrollment that they've projected for our school is far lower than our own projected enrollments. And we also know there's always last minute people coming in. And so we think if we go to them and speak sense and tell them that your enrollment is off and you need to fund per student this amount, we feel we can get that budget restored. So we're just telling you, be forewarned, this is a worst case scenario. But as other schools had tried to advocate for themselves, we're hearing it didn't go well because the budget was the budget. Mayor was, set in his ways. He used a formula called fair student funding. Now, this is a formula that came about during the Bloomberg, when the Chancellor Cohen days, when they were determined an allocation per student. The idea was to create equity, that every student costs this much money per year in the school funding. But what it did, it actually ends up not being fair. It doesn't equate for schools that have students with special needs or require, schools that have might need more social workers and counselors. It might be the students that have home or food situations where they're the instability, and also. Take a small school like mine. There's certain things, I worked at a small school, there's certain things you need, like a principal, you need an assistant principal, you need a nurse. All these things are far more part of their overall budget than for a school of like 5,000 students. The school of 5,000 has an AP and a principal too, but that's a far smaller portion of their budget. So, my principal explained to me that fair student funding is not fair at all. And it was unfortunately impacting them more substantially than some other schools. But be that as it may, we were slated to lose. She said the music program would have to go. And as we start hearing schools are losing their appeals, it just, she was just laying out the picture that it wasn't looking good. And so I was let go from the school. And I started to write on Twitter, and I'm not much of a Twitter person, but I started to write a story because it was affecting me a lot. This one of my students was, I was asking kids at the end of the year, as I always do, what are you doing over the summer? And one of them said, well, I'm going to go to camp for a month, but then I'm going to spend August trying to raise money. I'm going to open a lemonade stand to try to see if I can get your job back because we want music at our school. And that just like impacted me. Like, what do you say to that? All right. And so I put that up on Twitter. And I a couple other quotes, and also they started getting retweeted, and then like New York Times people were retweeting them, and the next thing I know, I start getting journalists, reaching out to me and saying like, "Hey, we'd like to talk to you about, the lemonade stand girl, or about what's going on with you," because I became like one of the first like real life examples because the mayor had presented a much rosier picture to the city council about what these cuts would mean than what they actually meant. They were described as being like very minuscule, not only affecting newer teachers, programs wouldn't be touched. Of course, my program was touched and many others. And that, so basically they were not presented an accurate picture of what would happen. So city council votes on it, thinking that it sounds like a very small cut, and teachers such as myself would be secure. And then they start hearing from us. I reached out to some of the council members that you and I know in South Queens and other places where my school was, and the same story started to appear. Wait, you lost your program? You're a teacher since 2005. You've been at the school since 2009, and wait, a Park Slope school is not going to have music? Like, whoa, wait, this is insane. And so all this stories started popping up across the 5 boroughs. And I think a lot of the city council members started realizing that they're caught with egg on their face. They were told one thing by the budget department from the mayor, and it was not reality. And now they're being hit with reality. And they just realized not only did they vote on a budget, but they voted on it 3 weeks early, and they started, celebrating to a certain extent. Many of them are first-year council members, and they thought they had done a really good job, and then realizing that, no, this is a big problem. So as I said, the tweets started getting attention. I started talking going on some radio shows and doing some interviews with like New York Post. And so then Leonie, who heads Fast Size Matters, it's a school advocacy group. She mentioned to me, she's like, "Hey, Paul, we're trying to get a lawsuit together." She explained it to me that apparently when the chancellor has a budget, there is a crucial middle step that was not taken in this instance. There is something called a PEP, that's a panel for education policy. They meet regularly to discuss issues. It could be contracts with the city, with our different businesses, that supply paper or whatever to schools. But in this case, they were going to have a PEP about the budget. They were supposed to be presented with the budget, and you have a ton of parents on the call, and it's like a town hall almost, like they got a chance to speak out. And
well,
the mayor
to jump in real quick, what you mentioned there is actually analogous to an EIS, really, for the budget, because
yes.
What we didn't mention when we talked about the EIS is that it has a public comment component. So part of what it does is it allows the public to give their input before a major project happens. And this is really a step that's similar in the sense in that it's supposed to give people a chance to speak on what happens with the way their money is spent. And you're saying that they skip that step, right?
Right. Yeah. So an EIS has completely has a community outreach, does town halls. It's an expensive and in-depth study that could take a year plus. That can cost $1 million plus, but it will give you a nuts to bolts. Everything that goes on in the study. And so yes, the PEP was supposed to hear from the chancellor, presented with the budget, and parents could express their concerns. At the time, early June, before the budget was approved, our comptroller, Brad Lander, he was starting to raise alarm bells. He was saying this is going to kill arts and music programs. Like he was saying this, and unfortunately, the city council didn't get the proper feedback because the PEP never happened first. So it would go from chancellor, approved by the PEP, with that forum for city council members to hear concerns about the budget, and then go to the city council for final approval. He declared an emergency. What emergency? I don't know, COVID. I'm not really sure what the emergency was, but it doesn't seem like this is an emergency situation that it had to be shoved through.
Now, when does this panel have its power? Is it anytime there's a budget effect? Is it any cut to education? I mean, what kind of sparks that power? When do you need to consult with this panel, or is it always with every budget?
Every budget, yes. From what I've been told, you have a budget. Now, this isn't the first time an emergency has been declared. There's been precedent for this. So I think the chancellor was going off of that. Oh, I'll just say it's an emergency, skip these guys. Now, granted, a lot of them are appointed by the mayor. He is a super majority. But the point is that you have advocacy groups like Make the Road and more caucus in the UFT and in our teachers union that would have a chance to speak and advocate and explain why this is a bad thing. And they didn't have a chance to speak their voice. A huge portion of the democratic process was just taken away. And so emergency, it's almost like declaring martial law, right? We have an emergency. This, all these protections you think you have are gone. So we're going to declare martial law. We're going to take away the PAP and we're going to create this nice, pretty spreadsheet that's a PowerPoint presentation that's going to show that nothing bad's going to happen with these budget cuts. It's fine. We're just gradually weaning you off of the federal stimulus money that is there, that can be spent. In other words, this isn't a cut that has to happen. The money is there. And then the city council was presented this way. I don't think very many of them looked too closely at the numbers behind it because the mayor said, we gave you all the information you need. It's not our fault if you didn't, read the fine print, so to speak. So they approved it. And so our lawsuit basically is stating that you did not follow proper protocol. You did not allow for the PEP to have their budget meeting to approve the budget before going before the city council. It's a strong case. And that's what's going to be going before the New York Supreme Court on August 4th.
Okay. So Lixa in the chat says they declared emergency and hurt the schools. Very sad. I mean, yeah, true. Some emergency, right? You want to declare an emergency to do good, not to hurt teachers and students.
Right.
So,
It's been an interesting trip because now the mayor has pointed fingers at everyone but himself. He's pointed fingers. Well, it's the federal stimulus money that's going. Well, it's de Blasio's fault because the schools were flushed with money under him, and now we got to take things back. It's actually we're going to blame fair student funding on the state, even though they had nothing to do with it. I'm just pointing fingers. Right. Now he's pointing fingers at me. He's pointing fingers at the lawsuit. Yeah. So he's saying he's actually frozen everything. We've heard of like arts initiatives that were already funded. And he's like, oh, sorry, you're not going to get a chance to do that. Blame the lawsuit. They're the ones holding up everything.
Right.
So he's trying to point fingers at us.
So you got the TRO, which is a temporary restraining order pending the next hearing of the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, that puts a freeze on things. Now, does that just freeze the cuts to education, or does that freeze all allocations of the budget? What is the scope of the TRO?
That's a good question. From what I did ask our lawyer this question, and she says it's compartmentalized to education funding. So like, for example, if we get what we want, which is the opportunity to provide the city council with a revote, because Adrian Adams put out a letter. There were 41 city council members that signed on to it. There were, I think, about 10 that did not going to name names, but that they said that they felt that they were, misled, and that it was asking the mayor to restore funding to the schools that they deserve. So we have a feeling, if given a chance for a revote, those 41 city council members will probably take advantage of that and vote no.
Or would it be a revote on the entire budget or just on the education cuts?
That's what I asked, and what I've been told, it would be compartmentalized just to the education budget.
Okay.
So what happens in the meantime? You got the temporary restraining order. What happens in the meantime for yourself and people like you? Like, you go back to work, you get your salary, or it's like you're in a waiting game and doesn't, what happens?
This is the crazy thing, Jay, is that I'm going to get paid either way. Getting removed from my school community is just harming the school community. So what happens with a teacher? Let me try to explain this. So if a teacher gets excess, so if we're cut, like the music program gets cut, I'm a music certified teacher, I'm no longer a member of that school community. I am considered a teacher in excess. So over the summer, there is a portal that any teacher can use, excessed or otherwise. That's called the open market hiring system. So any school that has an opening they have to put that opening for fairness and transparency on the open market site, and then anyone can upload their resume and cover letter to that school and apply for a job. So this is a system that came about since I've been a teacher, and it's a great way. You want to move somewhere closer to your home, you can just start looking, see is there any schools open. So this is open until about August 7th, I believe. So we're getting near the end of open market hiring. I can tell you there's very few jobs out there. When you cut budgets for over 75% of schools, there aren't too many hiring music and art teachers, I think there's currently 3 openings in all of Manhattan. And there's about the similar for Brooklyn and for Queens. There just aren't that many openings. After that portal closes, another portal opens up that's just for excess teachers. It's kind of the last minute scramble. Like schools are just finalizing, or someone moves out, and they need a position. It's the last hope before we become what's called an ATR, which is a floating sub. In other words, they could have a music teacher such as myself teaching AP history to high school in the Bronx. Could happen. They try to keep you like in the same district as your school, but they said you can literally be sent to Staten Island. It's wherever there's a need. What they said is there will never be a day you're going to be sitting at home twiddling your thumbs. We will always find something for you to do. So that's kind of what I don't want to have happen. I don't want to be an ATR because my principal has told me she gets a list of ATRs at the beginning of every school year. Some have been in the system, she says, for 6 years. They've just been doing this floating game. Which is, it's demoralizing. And,
right. Maybe a little unrelated, but on a similar type topic, I dealt with the unemployment system when they tried to take unemployment back from teachers because during COVID, obviously a lot of teachers went on unemployment. Then they played these games where they would say, well, we offered you work and you didn't take it, but they might have offered a job, 3 boroughs away in a place that you never would have taught before, teaching something you don't usually teach. And if you don't take that job, then they say, well, now you're no longer eligible for unemployment because we did try to give you work.
All right.
I actually had a teacher who was dealing with that.
Yeah, that's a concern of mine too, is I know as an ATR, it's kind of like unemployment in a way. You're supposed to keep actively searching. I don't know if there's ever a point where it's like you take this job in Hunts Point, even though you don't have a car, or else you're going to get let go. That's one thing I will discuss that with the union if it ever comes, to the point where I'm in excess. But the idea hopefully is that it won't come to that I can help be part of the lawsuit. So right now there's 2 teachers and 2 parents on it. Technically, I'm a parent and a teacher. And also I'd like to add that my children, I have 3 daughters that go to local schools here in Richmond Hill. Their schools are also experiencing detrimental effects from these cuts. I found out that where 2 of my daughters are going. Now, when I spoke to them about the cuts and I started to get involved with activism with this, I said, how are these cuts affecting you? Because there's a spreadsheet. You can actually look at how much the school is getting cut. It was something like $750,000 for my daughter's school. And they're like, well, we think we can get a lot of that back with grant money, but we're proud to report that we're not going to be having to fire any teachers. Now that was great. But then I found out there's a little more to that story. The music teacher who used to teach there decided to leave for a school closer to home. And granted, yes, they're not firing a music teacher, but they're not deciding because of the budget cuts, they're not able to replace that music teacher. So they're not firing the music teacher, but my daughters, and as a music teacher, they're not getting music at their school anymore. It's just not going to happen because of the budget cuts. So that's another music teaching position that's just gone. And where my youngest daughter goes, they're losing a guidance counselor. And I can tell you this, as a teacher during this pandemic, I've never seen as many meltdowns or students in crisis as we're seeing now. All of us are just looking at each other as we hear kids screaming and, it's just, it's just like, my God, what is going on? I've never seen so many students that have needs. To not have that second guidance counselor or the support, or because social workers are also getting hit hard. Guidance, social workers, all these, things that are not considered as, unfortunately, schools are based, a lot of their ability to survive is based off of testing of math, science, art. And so the other subjects aren't considered as important, or guidance, social workers. So these are all the areas that are getting hit the hardest.
Sure.
And that's my biggest issue with the mayor is he's calling this right sizing, or, there was a town hall he had in Harlem where there was an activist who spoke out about the cuts and called them a clown. I don't know if you saw that. That like made a lot of news. And then he started into his usual like line saying, "I'm not new to this." I'm like, well, if you're not new to this, then you know the arts and music were going to get cut. So don't be telling city council that this is only going to be new hires, because you know that's not the case. If you're maybe you are new to this. So I'm not new to this. I know how it goes. I'm not the first time I've been cut, you know, or they tried to cut me. So
we talked about it last week right here on the show, how music education in particular is so important to making someone a well-rounded person. And that gives us a better, more enriched society. And I know, like you said, people might look at it like, well, if you're going to make some priorities here, you know, you have to maybe stick with the basics and art, I mean, or even math and science, or let's say history, let's say, but you can't neglect music and these extracurriculars, if you know, if you will, because that really exercises a part of the brain that maybe isn't used with these other subjects, and really goes into making someone a better person.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's very necessary. And unfortunately, it seems like when these budget cuts happen, the first things they go for are these, like, you know, arts and humanities types of areas.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and that's what's happened. It's happened to me as a father. From two of my daughters will no longer have music, and it's happened to me as in my profession that I no longer have the music teaching position I want. You know, in the community that I was happy with. I was, you know, I felt for the first time, yes, okay, we had this federal funding coming in. What happened with the pandemic is, yes, there are some parents and families that left, but, you know, to have with Bloomberg, his idea was everyone tighten their belt. We got to max the class sizes. That became the normal under like Walcott and Bloomberg. And now it was like I was teaching 20 or 22 in a class. And what I can do as a music teacher is I can put an instrument in everyone's hand. And what I can do as a music teacher is it doesn't become so noisy that students are, you know, covering their ears, because, you know, a lot have sensitivity to sound, and our room isn't soundproof. So that's what I tell the teachers who are like complaining about kids chatting. I'm always like, you know, how about when you have chatting and you have instruments being played at once, you know? So, I mean, I'm able to have a functioning class with every student being attended to and getting to know my students better. I don't have to teach to a test. I do have to teach to a performance sometimes, but with a smaller class size, I can get to know who they are and know what makes them tick. And that just makes us, you know, you've been in bands, you know, you need to have pancake breakfast sometimes, as Questlove said. I always love that line. Questlove says a band needs pancake breakfast. You can't just be just about the gig, you know, and preparing. You have to sit down with each other because it makes the band better.
Wow.
So, you know, I consider my classes like my band in a way.
It's really crazy, especially, I don't know, just it also reminds me of what's happening in Florida with they're having a teacher drought. Basically, they're not having enough people to come in and be teachers, and so the governor has allowed for veterans to take on teaching roles, even if they have no experience teaching. And not only veterans, but veterans and their wives can now go into schools and be the teachers, even if they have no teaching certificate and no background in teaching, because they're having
substitute teachers or full-time teachers.
Sorry?
Are they substitute teachers or full-time teachers?
I don't know specifically, but I think from the stuff that I'm reading, it sounds like they could just be full, because they're having a difficulty hiring teachers in Florida right now. For whatever reasons, maybe the pay has been reduced or cut, or whatever.
Definitely less than a lot of other places.
It probably destroyed the union there. That's probably.
So yeah, and so now they're like, oh yeah, we can. I forget the governor's name, but it's like, yeah, let's get these veterans in here, and he doesn't know how to teach. What is he doing in there? And the wives too. For some reason, you know, neither one of them can have any kind of experience. So it's kind of crazy.
Well, with everything going on in this crazy world, people might be trying to ease their burdens, relieve their stress, and in all kinds of ways. So on that note, we asked people last week what they thought. I see Jay just got the segue. What did people think about the federal effort to legalize marijuana? On my poll, 100% said yes. And there were a lot of people who answered too. It wasn't just a couple answered. A lot of people were drawn to my poll to say yes, Jay, and it was unanimous.
I figured a lot of people would chime in on that one. Yeah, and the polls that I ran, it was the same thing. It was 100% of people said yes, that marijuana should be legalized at the federal level at this point. And it actually did really well as a poll on YouTube. We had over, I think it was like over 1,600 views on the video for that poll. And there were some responses, and all those responses said yes. And then there were just a lot of thumbs up. So I'm going to assume, since they didn't respond, that the thumbs up means that they agree with it, and thumbs down mean that they disagree. And if that's the case, it was over 80% of people gave a thumbs up on that. So,
but you also might have had people, because I saw one of the comments, that were just upset that we asked the question again. Like, how come you guys keep asking the question instead of doing it? So that might have been a thumbs down for all we know. Like, why do you keep asking us this?
I'd like to tie it into to what we were talking about, that some states have legalized as a way to fund education shortfalls in budget.
Yeah. That's that tax money coming in can be allocated to many places, and education is a good one. So, just bringing that up and just a brief aside, I thought, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't the lottery supposed to be helping to fund education in New York?
That's true.
Is there not money there? They've taken in a gangload of money.
I don't know. Eric Adams was talking about, it sounded like he wanted to open up a whole bunch of casinos, which I'm just rooting for Resorts World by us here, because I think it could do a wonderful, it could be a wonderful boon to the economy for South and Southeast Queens. He was talking, I think, one at College Point. I mean, why don't you start with one in Queens and see how we do? But yeah, that money is supposed to go to education, correct?
Right. When I was working up in Albany, someone called me, and I forget all of the details now, but they were complaining that whatever research they found, whatever they looked at, seemed to suggest that not all of that money was going to education as promised, that somehow it was being appropriated in a different way, but they wanted to see more of it, as much of it as it was supposed to go to education, actually go to fund educational programs.
Right, and Lixa in the comment is saying that the casinos also.
Right, and Resorts has been a lottery casino, so that was how Resorts was able to operate even before New York moved to legalize traditional casinos. Resorts was operating as basically a lottery facility where you go in and you're playing these poker machines or these slots, but what you're really playing lottery. That was kind of the loophole that allowed it to open in the first place.
Yeah. So, they're saying they're bringing in billions of revenue, and, asking where the budget for education is going. Like, it would seem, even with the money they're getting from the government and the money they're getting from lottery and from casinos, you would think that you wouldn't be needing to do cuts like that. I could be wrong.
I just wish Eric Adams would spend half as much time as he is trying to fight what is an incremental amount. It's just a minuscule amount of the overall budget, and work on trying to advocate to get money for schools, not be so concerned with depending on the estimate, somewhere between 250 or 475 million dollars, which is just a drop in the bucket. If you spend half that time maybe trying to advocate to get us more funding, or to come to accept, like, wow, it doesn't have to be shoestring, like schools can actually feel like they're getting funded instead of always feeling like we're getting some form of trickle down. I just wish that was more the norm. That schools should be funded. That you talk about wanting to lower crime, like I was about to say name, I'm not gonna, but I know there are schools that normally have a flourishing summer school program where kids can come and take credits. Usually it's more on the fun side. Like, let's say if they normally are doing like an art class, then here it would be they'd go to museums. They take advantage of what the city has to offer, and they do a class on that and get credit. I know of a school that is on shoestring amount of classes, that a lot of teachers that depend on those opportunities to make a little extra cash over the summer have been told they can't do it this year because of the cuts.
Right.
So now you have, and we all know crime rises in the summer, and most of the crime is committed by teenagers or young adults. That if you start cutting classes where kids can't engage in some form of education, then, like, how are you saying you're the mayor who's fighting crime,
That's a good point. And getting back to the marijuana issue, if you legalize it federally, that will allow marijuana businesses to move away from being cash only businesses. Now they're using the banks. Now more of those transactions really are going to get reported, and you're going to see more tax revenue as a result of that. And yes, I agree. Let's put that to education.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, cash businesses, it's easy to underreport what's coming in. So,
right.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, if our results match what's the sentiment in the country, then I think it should be legalized at the federal level. It's pretty archaic.
It makes sense. I think since the states are moving in that direction, what is the argument really against it? I mean, even people on the right who say it's all about states' rights. Well, the states are speaking on this too. So why is the federal government blocking it at this point?
Right. Absolutely.
So we only have a few minutes left. Really, we're over time, so we want to wrap up, but we do want to get to the topics. We'll want to put out a poll question for this week, and I don't know how much time we're going to spend on it, but we figured monkeypox is a big issue, and we want to get people's thoughts as to whether they were concerned it was going to be the next pandemic. I know people talk about pandemic fatigue, but these issues are very real, so we have to deal with them. Monkeypox is one of those things where we just hear about it now, but I don't know if it's affected anyone that we know. I mean, I read about it in the news, but I don't know anyone, I don't think, who has suffered from it. So, until it hits home, I think people have a hard time taking things seriously, even though we really should. Right.
The WHO about last week or the week before issued a global warning about monkeypox. And in New York just recently issued a state of emergency over monkeypox because the cases are on a rise. So, it's like one after another. It's kind of crazy. And then you take COVID, which is back on a big surge. And so some of the mask mandates are coming back into play in a lot of places, and cases are going back up. So, could we be looking at another thing with monkeypox?
Well, I guess that could be the poll question of the week. Are you concerned that monkeypox could become the next pandemic?
Yeah, man. Hopefully they can curtail this before it gets around. One thing I think we can say is monkeypox isn't new, like COVID was. So there are already treatments. There's already things in place that can be used to treat it. So hopefully we can keep that under control, because we already have measures for monkeypox, and we know about monkeypox. So that should be fine. And I think one other point that real quickly should be addressed is that early on, when monkeypox was coming out as spreading, it was being reported that it was largely, the people getting affected were largely gay men, and those make up the bulk of the cases. However, it is not a gay disease. It can be transmitted to anybody. It's just that this was the group that was being infected at the time and still have the majority.
Right. And it isn't strictly a sexually transmitted infection either.
Right.
You get it just from breathing on people, I believe.
And touching the fluids or the scabs that form, or touching things that might have it on it, it's possible to spread that way. So it's definitely not just like a gay disease or from a sexual disease. So
right.
Let's hope this doesn't spread out. We need to get rid of COVID. Let's not add something to it.
Yeah. In fact, my daughter got her best friend's birthday got canceled last week because the girl got hand, foot, and mouth disease. Coxsackie it's called. And I'm like, oh yeah, those things that kids get, they still happen. You forget during everything's COVID. Oh yeah, there's still hand, foot, and mouth disease and pink eye and all that lovely stuff you get from being in the classroom.
Are kids get mono anymore?
I'm sure they do. I got my daughter and I got the flu in springtime. We both got it together, so had an enjoyable few days at home with that. So all that stuff's still going around. It didn't take a break because of COVID.
Right. So,
Well, Paul, we thank you for joining us. And what we've been doing here is we've been allowing our guests to give us the last word. We call it the bottom line. So whatever closing thoughts you have on whatever you want to discuss, whatever you want to leave people with, the floor is yours. What is the bottom line?
Sure. I'll say two things. First, I'm going to do a plug. And the plug is if the story about these budget cuts has engaged you, the court date again is August 4th at 10 a.m. at the New York State Supreme Court at 80 Center Street, room 308. You can join us at the courtroom to show your support. But before then, there's going to be a rally at Foley Square at 9:30 a.m. So come down, bring your signs, let Eric Adams know he is on the wrong path on this. Let him know that getting things done should not involve undoing all the work that we've done, try to get normalized things for the pandemic with our students and do the best job we can. So, we appreciate, any support you can give on this because these kids need their music programs, need their art programs, need their guidance counselors. And we'll see if we can get it done.
Excellent. Well, good luck to you, and we commend you for all that you're doing. I think you're fighting the good fight, and that's what we need. No one better than you to do it. So, we hope that this can be reconsidered, and hopefully it will lead to another vote with more information that these council members will then be able to responsibly address this. It seems like they weren't given that chance initially.
That's what it seems like, yes. So we'll have to see how it goes. Stay tuned. It's going to be interesting no matter how it turns out.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And thank you all for tuning in. This has been Nuance. Don't forget, subscribe on YouTube, Nuance with Mike Scala and Jay Carter. You can also check out the audio wherever podcasts can be heard, Apple, Spotify, so on and so forth. We'll catch you all next time. Bye-bye.